enough disclosure. So we had quite a week last week in the world. We talked earlier about the hurricane that came through the U.S., but you had potential new red lines from Russia on nuclear, the Middle East conflict as continuing to escalate, with Iran and Israel firing at each other now. And then you have China announcing new stimulus efforts. And then you had some interesting numbers out of the U.S. labor market, which now call into question how aggressive the Fed's going to be. So there's a lot going on. We've covered a bunch of those topics. Today, I want to focus on China, and I'm going to talk about the stimulus, and then Francis will talk about 5 scenarios for the future of China, and a very interesting take on the different scenarios. So let's jump right into it. I will just say that I am a big fan of China. I've been for a long time. I think the Chinese economic miracle is one of the more spectacular economic events that's occurred in the last 50 years. But I think 11 years ago, things changed. I think President Xi then was selling the China dream, which was a vision that China would be soon be the world's greatest power and reclaim its rightful place in history. And I'm not sure that vision didn't move away from bringing benefits to the people in a way that was part of the promise to the Chinese people when they were working. But I would just say the promise hasn't worked as planned. The economy is going through a pretty tough spot, and the government's heavy hand is getting a little heavier, and that's creating issues with people and outflows, and social stability is now coming into question more. If economic prospects don't improve, I think it'll be a bigger issue. So, but the stimulus was started, and people have been waiting for a while. The question is, why didn't China do something sooner? I think it has to do with the economic position of the country right now. I think the debt issues and other issues are more structural than can be fully addressed with stimulus measures. But I think it's a step in the right direction. And when you look at it, the stock market clearly enjoyed the rally, but will it be enough to reverse the trends? And I think the question there is, and Francis will show you charts later about how amazing what China's economy and their growth has done. But moving to lower growth rates in and of itself is not a problem. When you're growing the economy as fast as they have over the last 20 years in particular, but even going back further, you can't sustain double-digit growth rates on an economy for extended periods. So moving down to 5% or below is not unusual, but I think the structural problems that exist are really what's the concern. So how did we get here? I think transitioning from a developing economy to advanced one, they've done it better than anyone. They blew through the $6,000 per capita GDP that was usually the stumbling block for a lot of developing economies. And but now they're getting to where they're having some digestion issues because of property challenges, globalization, shifting, geopolitics, and challenges with the consumer. And I think the weak consumer consumption in the near term is a setback because they need to get the economy better balanced, moving from an investment-driven economy that they did through most of that high growth period to more balanced with investment and consumption. And we take for granted in the U.S. the fact that with an almost 70% consumer-driven economy, what goes on in the rest of the world matters, but it matters a little bit less for us to be able to keep our economy going because of our consumption. I think China needs to get to a much healthier level of consumption to get better balanced, and that's a key element of where they're going. But they have started to address the property and stock market issues, which are very important. So while we've had a rally, and last night the announcement of future stimulus was viewed by some in the market as underwhelming. I think when you look back at where we've been over the since the start of the year, there's still a lot of wood to chop to get back to the high level mark, but I think there's a lot of work to do in the economy overall. I think the challenges in the property market, in the labor market, and in the stock market have really damaged consumer confidence. I think there's also issues of attacks on on corporate leaders over the years and other things that have led to an issue that now you can see consumer confidence at a record low back to 92. I also think as you look at the chart, the pandemic initially was not as big a problem, but as we moved along and the reopening was a little slow, I think that was a bit of a challenge. But I think this is one of the big ones, and you have youth unemployment rising. Francis reminded me, I left this out at 8:00, but we've talked about it in the past. China redid their calculation of youth unemployment a year or two ago and lowered it, and now it's back up to the range that they were at, or I guess it hit a high of about 21% at one point. But you have 11.5 million graduates from university, and these are young people ages 16 to 24 not in school. So getting those people to work and giving them the hopes of a better life was part of the promise, and that's what people are waiting to see, and that's where the social stability issue comes in. I think there are other issues that have gone on geopolitically and even in some of the internal policies of how corporate leadership has been attacked, like Jack Ma, that have led foreign investors to have changing views of the China opportunity and very divergent views. So there are some that think it's still the best place to look going forward, and there are others who wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. I think it's much more nuanced than that. And like every economy, there is positives and negatives, but what the foreign investors are saying with their feet is there are better opportunities elsewhere for a variety of reasons. I think that is changing somewhat with the potential stimulus, but I'm not sure if they can reverse it and make it sustainable the other way without some other changes going on. I think part of the challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is the heavy hand of the government. And this is just a chart that shows the share of market cap of the top 100 companies by ownership. And as you can see, when Jack Ma was probably hitting his peak around 2020, you started to see that was as far as the government felt comfortable with corporate champions becoming so dominant. And now it's not a great thing to be the richest guy in China. It's actually a bit of a bullseye. And I think that's one of the challenges of innovation and entrepreneurship. If you don't reward success, how do you move forward effectively? I also think it's led to some challenges with fundraising for VCs and getting the startup community going. And these numbers were pretty staggering to me. The drop from 51,000 startups in 18 to 1,200 in 03 is not exactly the sign of a robust economy moving forward. And as we know in the US and other places, it's small businesses that really can make a huge difference in the economy. And this is not a great sign of, but it's not what you wouldn't expect with capital flowing away from it and confidence as low as it is. Not exactly an ideal time for starting a business. For those who are timid, it's actually the ideal time if you're an entrepreneur, but less competition and better opportunities. But I think this speaks to the challenges of the backdrop, both economically and geopolitically, and domestic politics in China. The US rate cut was a positive for China. I think it enabled them to stimulate more aggressively without worrying about the currency differentials and what that means for a lot of markets. It's also been, with the China easing and stimulus, it's given a boost to commodities, energy, and other areas. So it's reinvigorated some things that have been lagging for several months. But as you look at this chart, this is where the expected borrowing costs would be at the end of the year. I think China may make another move before then. I think the US may be more questionable as how much we move. I just saw for November, there's a 16% chance of a 50 basis point cut and a 60 basis point chance of a 25 basis point cut. So rate cut expectations in the US have come in considerably given the employment numbers. So China's done quite a bit so far to try and get things moving. I'm going to show you that in a minute. They're working towards 7% of GDP. But for perspective, from the pandemic through the start of the war in Ukraine, and even beyond that, the US has done about 50% of GDP between monetary and fiscal stimulus, with more to come if you believe either of the candidates and their programs. So I think China needs to do more to deal with the structural problems that they have. I think what they're doing is the right stuff to do. It's whether it's enough to do right now or what they've done, it's too little too late, is one of the questions. I also think they've really challenged themselves with how foreign companies can operate inside China, and some have navigated exceptionally well, others have run afoul. And I think making long-term investment decisions on your China role for foreign companies is one of the most important decisions they'll make. So what's next? This is just a partial list of the policy actions since the start of the year, and it's been a combination of monetary stimulus, some credit work, trying to support local governments, giving them capital to buy, support the real estate and property markets in their areas and try and get things going. They're also taking steps to prop up the equity market and really focusing on anything they can do to build confidence. I think it's interesting that they're doing $41 billion in tourism financing as well to try and attract people and capital back into the country. So it's $1 trillion so far, which is not insignificant. How much more will they do is the question, and I think people are a little disappointed from yesterday. So going forward, how do you play China as an investor? Here are two very different opinions. Buy everything from David Tepper and wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole from Stan Druckenmiller. I think the reality is somewhere in between both. But who might have bet against these two guys with what they've accomplished? I had a chance to work with Stan for a year or two back in the 80s at Dreyfus, and he's one of the better thinkers around. And I remember back in the 80s, he had a view that even Japan, with the way the companies were operating there, was not necessarily the type of environment you'd want to feel comfortable fully investing in back then. So I think he takes a little bit different view, but I think this is one of the interesting issues, Mark, and we can see where we go from here. So we can take a couple questions, then we'll get to Francis if that works.
Ready?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to add some information that I've noticed that China has loosened up some visas policy for some countries, allowing for longer stays. So, like, it really corresponds with the tourist money injection that you, Stephen, mentioned. And again, thanks a lot for the summary.
Thank you. Unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, the FT reported yesterday that China has a passport program for teachers and public employees where they have to turn in their passports and apply for visas to travel outside the country. And one of the teachers who studied English and dream was to go out and speak English in an English-speaking country and learn more about it, thinks that vision might have been certainly damaged. So they give on one hand and take away on the other. So that's part of the complexity of investing in China today. But I think you could say the same about the US and Europe as well. So I don't think
sorry, Stephen, you're saying Chinese nationals have to submit their passports to the Chinese government in order to travel overseas?
No, before that, right now, and then to travel overseas, they have to apply for a visa. They have to apply for permission to travel overseas.
Oh,
Stephen, are you aware of the project that the Chinese government is doing in Hainan? It's the southernmost point of China. They are building a city to, I guess, replace Hong Kong, where supposedly you can fly in without a visa, open a bank account. It's a free trade zone. they have this program for anything, any industry to come in and
I assume Francis might be familiar with that.
they have a process for even medicine to fast track the process that's supposed to be like the FDA approval to get entrance into Southeast Asia, much quicker. And they're going all out. I was there last year for a month, and I'm supposed to be there in a few more weeks to take a look at all this. They want me to bring in business from Latin America and to set up shop there. But supposedly they're making everything easy peasy for everybody to come in, bring money in, out.
Let's pause for a second. Francis, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is a free trade zone that is offering easier access, particularly for medical device investments, as well as duty-free shopping for the domestic Chinese. Make it a place where basically they do their duty-free shopping at home without leaving China. I wouldn't bet too far outside of those areas. You probably anywhere in China, if you're making an investment right now, the processes are going to be much quicker. There's much less competition. They're welcoming foreign investors right now in a big way.
Well, I want
Everywhere.
Francis to introduce himself properly, but you had your hand up. One more question from Wanda, then I'll turn it over to you, Francis.
Thank you, Stephen. Just a quick clarifying question regarding slide 12. If you could get to slide 12. So the source is Bloomberg, but peculiar source, the survey of Czech economists?
Oh, 1 sec. Let me get to 12. 12.
I have a habit of checking the sources of the information. So slide 12.
It's the Bloomberg forecast for Czech. They use the survey of Czech economists, and they use the central bank estimate for Norway on where they're going. It's not the Bloomberg economist for that. So the Czech.
So it's a combination of sources.
Yeah, the Czech Republic survey of economists in the Czech Republic provided that information for Czechoslovakia.
Okay. Oh, for the Czech Republic.
Slovakia.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it. Thank you.
So Francis, we've met 5-ish years ago, and you've lived now 25, 30 years in China, based in Shanghai, and has been helping companies basically enter the Chinese market. But he's been calling it like he sees it. I even asked him at 8 o'clock why he hasn't had that cup of tea, so to speak. And you never know. Tomorrow may be the day, but I'll let him properly introduce himself and then share his views. He also just came out with a recent report, which is what led to him coming on here today.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, the report is in the chat, so I'll be referencing a little bit of that's in the report, and then riffing off of Stephen's presentation. I run a consulting practice that focuses on the private equity markets, mostly coming out of North America and Europe. So cost reduction, growth strategy, M&A advisory related to China. I'm based in Shanghai. I've been based here for the last 25 years. I've lived in China basically 35 of the last 40 years. We get involved in a lot of different industries. So what you're hearing comes from everything from luxury goods to premium spirits to furniture. Bearings, we touch a lot of different things. So this is sort of my information sources are coming from these areas, mostly in the middle market. So firms that are sort of in the somewhere between 200 million to $1 billion is where we play. I'm going to be sharing some slides, which should be coming up here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is some based on what Stephen was showing, but also based upon what we're dealing with a client base right now that is, like as the title of this was The Death of Globalization and Why Risk Avoidance is a Bad Idea. And I think what a lot of people are looking at the global markets right now, and they have a dystopian view of the world, and they're basically there's too much risk avoidance. And I think that they're basically having, like Howard Marks would say, they're going to have return avoidance as well. Looking at China, I'm going to go back to the 1960s, and you take a look at the bar chart there. This is Chinese GDP. It was virtually non-existent until they joined WTO in sort of 2002, 2003. And the GDP growth rates have been sort of hovering at almost astronomical rates since that period, growing at almost 10, 15% over that period. If I shorten the slide up to show you the period that Stephen was showing, you'll see that the GDP grew in absolute numbers to where it is right now at about almost $20 billion in 2024. And so when you see a dramatic decline in the growth rate, I think it's important to keep in mind the absolute growth that China has been through, and that's partly the reason why they cut a lot of slack to the CCP, is that they were the people who delivered this fantastic growth. Now the growth has also been pretty consistent on a GDP per capita basis, and the elites and the urban residents have really won most of the spoils over this period of basically 13% per annum growth, a CAGR, over the 2003 to 2022 numbers for GDP. And that's the big story for me is when you look at this projecting going forward. If we look at the top left, if the economy continues to grow at 2%, it adds $3.5 trillion over the next 6 years. If it grows at 5%, it basically increases by 50%, adding almost $10 trillion, not billion dollars, $trillion. And this wealth continues to concentrate in the urban areas, which is very, very important from an investment perspective. And so in 2020, you had about 55 cities comprising 27% of the population and 47% of GDP. In 2030, we'll have 93 cities, 44% of the population. That's 900 million people. That's 600 million people. In about 64% of the GDP. So this urbanization continues, and this is where the opportunity is. And I find so many people are getting caught up in sort of the day-to-day, are we going to war? What are the potential futures of China? That they're not focusing on, even with all these potential dystopian outcomes, what is the size of the opportunity? Like we're in the business of deploying risk capital, and we should be focusing on where is the potential return. One other thing I wanted to point out was over the period from 2020 to today, we've added almost $10 trillion in savings in Chinese households, just in bank deposits over this time period. So there's an enormous amount of money sort of waiting to get played into the market. And I think we saw that over the last week when the stimulus got announced, and then a lot of people jumped out because I don't know, the central government continues to drive, and I think they have mainly bad decision making around most macroeconomic and geopolitical issues, and that's got everyone skittish here. In the piece, we're going to talk about, in the piece that's in the chat, we talked about the potential futures for China, and there were about 5 scenarios that were identified in that piece. And one is a confrontational China, which is everyone sort of aware of, that there's going to be a battle over Taiwan or the Spratly Islands or something in the South China Sea is going to create a hot war between the United States and China. A less talked about. One was, what about the potential for reform? Could there be a dramatic change in direction within the CCP that they look to and say, reform was something that served us very, very well in the past. Why not do it again? There's a successful China and there's a restrained China. When we look at, many people will say, oh, the U.S. is trying to restrain China. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of these scenarios, but the base scenario that we have basically is a shaky China. And that shaky China is driven, it's easier to look at it from this perspective, is that there are key drivers within the Chinese economy, demographics, debt, deflation, and geopolitics, which are inherently unstable just by the path that China has chosen, or in the case of demographics, just again, sort of the one-child policy and the path that's chosen, and the low fertility rates in China. And then there are these stabilizing factors, which are human and physical capital, there's some pretty fantastic human and physical capital in China. The infrastructure is fantastic. The supply chain is extremely robust and deep. The tensions that are driving on the economy are there's a socioeconomic stress where Stephen was alluding to. Unemployment is one of the areas, healthcare, education. There's some serious sort of structural problems within the economy that were not fixed when they sort of had the time to do them. And now that they're, for example, they raised the retirement age by 2 years from 52 to 54, and people freaked out. So these are very, very difficult, complex challenges. And the higher these socioeconomic stress gets, the shakier China gets. And similarly with state control, the higher the state control, the easier it is for one of the other two scenarios at the top to play out. So a successful China is one where many of their ambitions of the CCP are achieved, and also maybe in contrast to what happens in the West, maybe the West has some type of chaos or collapse. And so in relative terms, China looks more successful. And then in a low state control environment, then there's more likelihood for reform, and also for ability for the world to control China in a way. So when I talk about deploying risk capital, I'm trying to put odds against some of these different scenarios. And I think that my base case is that there's a very high probability, sort of a 45% probability, that we're walking down this path to a very, very shaky China. And when we walk down that path, there are black swans and gray rhinos of civil unrest and institutional failure. These are things that are coming at us, and how they're managed, both internally and externally, will determine which path comes after shaky. And so when I say internally, is there enough job creation? Is the housing problem resolved? These are things that will lead to civil unrest internally. But externally, if the U.S., let's say, performs fantastically and Israel dominates any of the proxy wars that are going on, and if Ukraine settles somewhat peacefully, these things actually reflect badly on the CCP decision to basically take the other side of all of those fights with the West. And you'll see that my projections on confrontation, which is something that most people, like the first thing that they talk about when they talk about China, is what's going to happen with Taiwan or South China Sea. I think this is a relatively low probability event, primarily because of the very, very high risk it would be for the Chinese military. They're completely untested, and taking Taiwan as an example, it's a very, very difficult military challenge. And so I go down these other areas, and I think that for me, from a investor's perspective, understanding what the returns are for things, you'll see that in all instances, even except confrontation, the return, the odds I'm giving are for a positive return. I don't think it's easy necessarily, but I think that it's a relatively better bet than many of the alternatives in terms of size. And the one example that we give is someone like Lululemon, who came into China only in 2017. They had 3 stores, and this year they have 127 stores. They have $1 billion in revenue, and their year-over-year revenue growth from 2022 to 2023 was 67%. So they basically almost doubled their income in China. So China's their number 2 market, and they expect to expand by 100 stores next 3 years and be about a $2 billion market. So we see these are the types of things that basically keep me attracted to this economy. And I think that this is what we're looking forward to right now, is we're going to enter a shaky period, and then out the other side of that, we've got one of these to look forward to. I'll leave it there.
So I see a couple questions. Hands are up already. Samir, Bill, Adam.
Yes.
Samir, you want to lead off?
You want to lead or?
No, Samir, Bill, then you.
Yep.
Okay.
So, so 3 questions. Number one, bank deposits, right? Usually when you have a large increase in bank deposits, and this is what we kind of saw in India as well, right? And I wanted to sort of contrast China and India a little bit. Anytime you have a large increase in bank deposits, that's good. That means that, people are saving. Clearly there's prosperity increasing, but if there's a culture of, let's say, saving as opposed to spending it because of demographics, right? People, the older you get, the less you want to spend the money, the more you want to save in the bank account. The question is, what does that portend for consumption going forward, right? So, what you want in an economy is consumption in order for, to get that ROI. So that's what Lululemon is banking on, right? Consumption as opposed to people sticking money in the bank. That's number one. Number two, the China stock market, if you contrast it to, say, India, right? The China stock market has been pretty much flat over the last, 10 years or so compared to India, which has grown 13 times. And the reason for that is the distribution of wealth, right? So if you contrast the distribution of wealth between, say, consumers and investors, I believe there's a difference there. So from an investor standpoint, putting money into China, there's a lot of growth. And if you're Lululemon, great, you're going to do great. But if you're a stock investor, are you going to do as well, right? Number three. Free zones, right? So India has Gift City in Gujarat, right? China just created its first free zone. Is there? That's a big topic, I know, but is there overall China and in India in terms of their external investment is one still easier versus the other? So,
I guess I'll go with the second one first. I don't think that the public equity markets are rational markets. They are still, it's state-directed capitalism. They don't operate under economic principles, and so I think that it's always a momentum play. And I think most people are probably better served staying away from the public equity markets. I think China is generally a direct equity play. So from a VC perspective, or from a direct, I buy an asset in North America and I do something with that asset. So for example, Patagonia has a horrific marketing and distribution strategy for China. Somebody should be working with that brand to help them realize their potential here. And there's a whole host of other differentiated products which play into the consumption patterns, which Lululemon has demonstrated. And you see that across the board. It could be a Tesla, it could be an iPhone, these types of things. I think these are the ways to play. So the stock market is irrational. The financial markets in China in general are dysfunctional, again, because the maniacal state, what would you call it? They just want to control everything, and that they're killing that goose. I think that the bank deposits are also a reflection of the structural challenges to the economy, because people have no faith in the future. They have no options to invest in the stock market because it's been a dismal return for them. They already have 1, 2 properties. There's nothing else for them to buy, and they have no faith in the future. They're worried about their children's education. They're worried about their employment for their children. They're worried about their own health care. So that money in the bank deposits it's not a good thing that China's average savings rate, I don't know where it is now, but for a long time it was in the sort of 45%. That's not a healthy thing, right? That's dead capital is what that is. And I'm not sure I understood the question regarding the free trade zone. I mean, China, the whole country was a free trade zone for like 30 years. So I think it understands the benefit of incentives. I actually don't think the decrease in FDI is representative of a problem only in China. I think that the FDI numbers are also showing that they're just better investments elsewhere in terms of moving capital globally. So, for example, you can feed at the trough of the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever the latest American boondoggle is. And Europe has had great plays in supporting the defense industries. So that's attracted a lot of attention of capital. The other thing is that capital domestically is not shown, that people are raising capital domestically through very, very cheap bank loans. That's not showing up in FDI numbers. So if you can finance at 2% locally or 3% locally, why would you get your money anywhere else? So I think that there's some firms in the United States that have been peddling this idea that FDI is dramatically down, and it's an oversimplification of what's happening.
Bill, you want to add on?
Yeah, actually, that's a great segue, perhaps to my question. So, and Francis's super overview, very, very interesting perspective that you've given to us. So thank you for that. So question, pre-COVID, it seemed as though, China, there was an entrepreneur, other than SOEs, there was an entrepreneurial wonderland that was just an amazing machine. And then it seemed as though everything stopped and everything changed at COVID. Witnessed the almost banishment of Jack Ma, et cetera. So you see that, do you see that coming back at all? And then B, to your point about kind of public-private markets, where you get the realization of all the promise of investing in private markets in China is when either you have a trade sale or an IPO. And so I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on the IPO side and for successful exits of companies that are in China.
Yeah, there haven't been, certainly over the last 4 years, it's been a dead IPO market, and the trade sales have been much, much slower than in the past. As far as the domestic IPO market, I think will open again if they're trying to continue to build this the stimulus package around that. So I still think it's going to be challenged. I mean, I think that the domestic IPO market is still going to be very, very challenged for a long period of time, and that if the investment thesis is that's what the exit is, I think that you have to, discount that as an exit. As far as the entrepreneurial spirit,
plus, Francis, you just discounted the markets in general as being state controlled or influenced.
Yeah, I mean
that earlier statement.
That's correct. That's correct. I mean that they don't have any of the institutional infrastructure, the professional services firms that the BlackRocks of the world, or I mean, it's just they're not allowing those people to operate in this market according to economic principles. It's all about control, and they don't want to lose control of capital markets. They're worried about a repeat of an Asian financial crisis like in 1997 or something like that.
Would can you touch on that before Adam's question, because the debt that's out there in the state and local governments and how does that all play into what's going on? Because the number seems to be pretty big, but unquantifiable.
Yeah, I'm not really concerned about the debt level, because I think if you were to take a look at I call it the stock portfolio of the CCP, their debt to equity ratio is pretty low, right? That they've got plenty of firms. Like, if it's funny, Nick Lardy did a study that he said if they reformed the economy and, let's say, got out of a lot of state-owned enterprises, you could have 6-8% growth for another 20 or 30 years. It's just like deregulation of the airlines in the United States. They can go through all of the recipe for returning to growth is really not that simple if they confront the thing that haunts them the most, is that if I get off this bus, am I going to get shot? Like, if I release my control of this, and that's what I think they're worried about. They're certainly the most senior leaders, I think, are worried about their own personal safety. So, but in terms of the local government debt, they could easily pay that off by just getting out of Sinochem or all of these other Bank of China, the assets that they just deregulate.
Over to you, Adam.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Great presentation, Francis. And Stephen, thank you for that question, because that's what I wanted to ask about. Francis, when you talk about they can easily get out of it, how they would have to take a haircut, and they would have to take equity in those positions, right? I mean, that's my first question to follow up on Stephen. The other question that I have is China's relationship with Russia. Is it a liability?
I asked him this at 8 a.m. today, Adam. So we'll see how he answers it this time.
Yeah. Is this an asset or is it a liability? Russia now sells it. That's the biggest export market for Russia in oil and other commodities. And Russia is also the biggest market now for Chinese automobiles. So, question, why, if she wants to become the global power, Russia doesn't seem like a great partner in that, other than being the tip of the spear in trying to tear down the existing system.
Yeah.
So,
I think, most of the crowd coming from the investment banking world will recognize that there was always a young buck who did a successful deal or two, and then they had the hubris to think that he can go out and do it on his own. And I think that kind of describes the way China has sort of gone through this last sort of 15-year period as it entered the global stage. And that they, if we go back probably about 10, 15 years, was the beginning of this whole wolf warrior policy. And there's a collection of diplomatic maneuvers or geopolitical strategies that I think have backfired on them. And because they've walked back from the whole wolf warrior routine. And, if we take a look at Russia, I think it was a miscalculation in terms of thinking that they certainly benefit from it in two ways, I think is very important. One is very, very cheap oil. And the other that's, I'm surprised doesn't get more press, is the transfer of military technology from Russia to China. And so they're gaining a lot of capabilities, probably mostly around air warfare and submarine warfare, which will be very, very useful to them. So they're losing certain credibility. And I think what the biggest problem is the collaboration and the alliance between the West and the EU, or Europe in general, and that trying to drive, their policy was a divide and conquer policy for a long time, and that I think that has failed miserably. And so I think geopolitically, if you take a look around at all of China's neighbors, none of it is a friendly relation. I mean, you might say that Vietnam's a little friendlier now, but they're still hacking each other on their boats and things like that down there. So there's a lot of problems with their geopolitical strategy. And as far as the assets that are on the books of the CCP, I mean, this is just deregulation of businesses. So they just need to basically get out of these businesses and maybe realize some of the equity that's on those businesses, distribute dividends, or however not manage them just to control them, but to free up some of the cash that's there.
Thank you, Francis.
Certainly.
I thought you made an interesting point, Francis, earlier in the morning. You sort of made it earlier in this call, that the more destabilized the West, broadly speaking, is, the better for Xi. And and if you said if Ukraine, if there's some kind of peaceful settlement, that he looks bad. But yet again, flip side, if more chaos ensues, they look like they look more. I guess this for the domestic audience. This is primarily he looks more like a victor.
Well, certainly. I mean, if you take a look at the COVID policy, it was relative performance. The early part of the COVID response, China was killing it. Right? And if you take a look at those consumer confidence figures that Stephen was showing earlier, up until 2022, everyone was happy. And then, the World Cup comes on, and they're looking at everyone and saying, hey, they're not wearing masks. And so in, typical fashion, what do? They stop showing the crowd. And that's sort of been the go-to for every problem, is to bury our head in the sand and lie to our children. And a
lot of nuances. I love your other comment was, it's not the protest in the streets, it's basically social media and humor and the other nuanced ways of protesting. But Wojciech, you have a question?
Yes. The Jack Ma disappearance and the reappearance, how does it influence the average Chinese businessman these days? Are they afraid of their property? And the second question, I've heard that there is a rule right now for the Chinese companies that they can invest up to $5 million, 5 million overseas without permission, government permission. How does it work? Is it really the no permission, or is just outside view?
I would, yeah, every entrepreneur looks at the sort of nationalization of Alibaba's assets at the same time that it happened with the restrictions that were put on the education markets as well. The random implementations of laws with very, very little warning and a lot of pain is something that's really impacting business formation, particularly in the tech sector, but I think entrepreneurship throughout the whole country. So again, another serious misstep. It was a misstep on his part for sort of being so confrontational and somewhat disrespectful. So there's a certain way that the game is played here, and he overplayed his hand. I think he had a certain level of hubris that he went a bit too far. But he was also stepping on with Ant Financial was going to start eating the cheese of the banks, and that was again pissing off the sort of that's their territory, right? And he should have been very, very cautious about moving on to some other family's territory, if you want to use mafia terms in looking at that. If as far as investment, outward bound investment, I think pretty much it's open. It's not. There's no limitation of a 5 million number. We have clients that are spending much more than that, and there are many ways to get money out, gray zone channels and things like that people use if it's a problem. It's more about the rationale of the investment thesis. I think that's, as long as there's a strong rationale for the investment, that generally speaking those investments are being made.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the Chinese investments into Western world. So I'm saying the Chinese companies investing outside.
It's a big movement right now because exports have been the one market that has been holding up really well. Mm-hmm. So it's the movement of the investment of, particularly in places like Mexico and Vietnam in particular, those two locations, but all throughout Southeast Asia and South America, Eastern Europe, and into North America as well. But into North America, they're masking. It's very difficult to be Chinese investing in the United States, and in some sectors it's very difficult to be a U.S. company investing in China. Mm-hmm. It's risky.
Michael Daly.
You're muted, Michael.
Yeah, just a very quick question. Francis, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned a report in the chat. I wonder if you could post it again, because if you join late or you get knocked off the call, you lose this screen.
Will do.
And what a great combination, Stephen Burke and Francis Balino.
That's it.
Dynamic duo. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
And it's past midnight where Francis is, so FYI. Thank you, Francis. Bill, another question?
You're on mute, Bill.
You're on mute, Bill.
There we go. Almost owed everybody a beer. So maybe just a quick follow-up. So Francis, it sounds like the quote new better way to play China would be almost to take their playbook in reverse. That is, non-Chinese companies who have compelling consumer products in particular to be able to go in and try to capitalize on the market there, which would sort of isolate them, from any of the things of the classic, direct investing into China and then hoping to capitalize that way, but instead doing it the other way by taking, coming in from the outside, essentially being a mercantilist almost.
Yeah, I like there's two ways I think that are interesting. If you're going down the cost reduction path, I think there's still a lot of runway in terms of creating very efficient, cost-effective supply chains. And in that instance, I would generally have some type of arm's length relationship and maybe small pieces of equity in assets, manufacturing assets in China. The supply chain, this whole idea of decoupling from China and we're no longer going to source from here is just that's for silly people who don't understand supply chains. There are very, very few industries where they can ignore China as a source of supply. Now, if tariffs go to 60% and they stay at an elevated level for a long period of time, maybe that'll change. So I think on the cost reduction side, there's a play. And so from that perspective, it's, do you have a distribution channel in North America or Europe? Or for example, I have a friend who's buying off-patent pharmaceutical products from Chinese manufacturers. He's actually buying the Chinese manufacturing operations and the global distribution because he understands how to distribute those products in certain markets that the Chinese don't really do a good job in. The Chinese, generally speaking, are good manufacturers, but they're not good once it leaves the Chinese shores. And so customer service, new product development, after sales service, these are areas I think are all very great opportunities. You can do it in I have another friend who's doing it in specialty chemicals, and he's sitting in Germany and selling specialty chemicals from Chinese suppliers who have all this capacity, all this great new product development capability, all these engineers and products, but they can't figure out how to get Hilda to buy it in Dusseldorf. So that's what he does. And he also does it in a way that masks where it's coming from if they need it to. So there's a whole supply chain piece to it. And then the Lululemon thing is about the differentiated products in categories. So, no one's going to displace an iPhone. Huawei's got a fantastic performing phone, but it doesn't have the iPhone ecosystem, and it never will. Tesla's doing it in cars. Pernod Ricard is doing it in whiskey. I think Patagonia should be doing it, but they seem to be doing it poorly. Even things like maybe like an REI. There's lots of different areas on the demand side that I think are very, very attractive.
But by the way, have you run into my former colleague Nick Lee from Morgan Creek? He lives in Shanghai.
I don't know.
Okay, I should connect you two guys.
Please do.
He's been there. He runs a China PE fund. Been there. He's Singaporean, but he's been in China for 20 years. Might be
you got two more. Adam and Wanda again.
Thank you, Francis. Can you talk a little bit more about the sector-specific areas that people can invest in where you're not really drawing the attention of the Chinese government in terms of their control, in terms of national security issues? For example, Jack Ma started eating up the pieces of the other family.
Adam, wasn't this the same question we had in Russia? And
absolutely.
Anything that required a license, anything that could potentially, like the play the Russian consumer market.
That's right.
It's a partly cloudy country. Go to the sunny consumer market. Stay there.
That's right. And Jack Ma's situation is very similar to Mikhail Hodorkovsky, where he was getting ready to sell Yukos.
Well, he wasn't running for president though.
Right.
He wasn't
No.
buying. He wasn't buying up all the deputies.
Well,
Just
similarities
always that.
Yeah. So that back to the.
Well, having said that, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, for my money, smaller is better. So you kind of stay below the radar is one of the areas, and I think having some sort of bifurcation of what's done globally and what's done domestically, and in many instances, I think masking the identity. So, even some things like, chicken feet for Tyson would get caught up in, trade wars. And so you'd think, the Chinese don't even, at that point, they didn't even produce chicken feet, but they became a hostage to things that were outside their control. So it's very difficult to say, like, it's not like the mafia has said, this is our turf and stay off it. The whole country is theirs to control. And so you never know what is, what they're going to want. There's certain. I'm sorry?
It's more about size than.
Well, yes and no, because then if you're Apple, then you're big enough to where, if they go after Tesla or if they go after Apple, then they're really creating, or in, BASF is another sort of example of a huge investment. They just, $10 billion is what they've committed. And, their leadership actually was, quite direct with the CCP, and confrontational in some ways, but in always constructive. Like they had strong opinions, but they were constructive, and they were making huge investments. So it's tricky. It's very tricky, and I think that it requires commitment, humility, patience, chutzpah. You got to have some nuts. Excuse the French.
Wanda?
Francis, in the past, when I was more hands-on with China, we looked into 5-year plans as signals from CCP, how they will handle economy. So we are in 24, that 25 is coming up, and I think those plans will be released. So my question is, are these plans relevant anymore? For example, EV market was flagged in the past and it really materialized. Telecom, digital technologies for controlling population, those areas were, presented in a very transparent way in the plans. So what do you expect in 25? Will it be relevant, or the politics will go one way and the public pronouncement of direction will be irrelevant?
No, I think they do telegraph. Those plans are worth reading. It's they kind of say what they're going to do, and they go out and do it. So I think they're still worth reading. And maybe for my money, if they wanted to go in that direction, I'd go the other way, or if I'm in the EV market, you know, I would think, well, how can I leverage this? But I don't want to be one of the other 100 EV companies that are trying to vie in this market, because no one's making any money. The profitability of they've, you know, this is the thing, is that what they've demonstrated is any time that they have this, you know, they're like children playing soccer. You know, the ball goes one way and everyone goes to the ball, and then they decimate the profitability of those markets. And this is the fundamental problem, I think, with the structure of the Chinese economy, is that no one's making any money. On a macro level, there's just so much destruction of capital.
So do you have any expectation of what will be telegraphed in 25, 5-year plan?
If frankly, I try to listen to them as little as possible.
Okay.
So I don't really know, but I would imagine that given the this sort of focus on AI, anything technology related, particularly technological independence. So chips is going to be areas, you know, these are all areas that are high voltage that I would just really want to stay away from. Maybe some of the areas where it might be interesting to play as a foreign investor, where you're not going to get in too much trouble, could be in the tourism space, or any of the sports areas. So, you know, if you're selling skis or, you know, outdoor clothing, outdoor camping equipment, maybe some of those areas I think where it could be interesting. Because
Thank you.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Certainly.
Francis, I only tried to rope you into this morning, so I'm sorry about this. It's midnight, past midnight for you, but thank you. It was phenomenal.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I hope it's helpful.
We appreciate it.
Certainly.
Good.
Appreciate it, Francis.
Francis, I'll connect with you when you're coming to the States. We'll get some time.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and attention.